Hi and welcome along to what is now our 19th conversation, and it's great today to be joined by Dr. Florence Hazrat, who's a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the University of Sheffield. And I will admit, whilst history is a big part of what Florence does and her research and her work and whatnot, this is one that's a bit different today, I think it's fair to say, because Florence, her work involves a lot to do with English and the English language and literature. So I think I best just pass over really to Florence, who probably could do a better job of explaining who she is and what she does.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be talking to you. My work is on punctuation. So that's the history of punctuation, why we're using it, how it came to be, which is the sort of historical part. A lot is also about the connection to writing and writing material, writing technologies. And I'm also interested in punctuation literature. So it's the sort of interpretative part. So why would there be a full stop or a comma? Why would an author choose that, or an editor? And why does it matter?
So as I said, this one's slightly different. I normally ask at this point about memories of studying history at a young age, but for yourself, I'm going to change that slightly, Florence, and ask your memories of studying, say, English literature at school. Anything that stands out?
Yes, so English is actually, I learned English when I was 12 at school. So I guess I have a different path to coming to English literature, I suppose, than maybe British people. But we had really lovely teachers, and it was very low-key school, actually. But I think actually me taking off and my love for English and my love for literature came with Harry Potter, which is funny because my sister actually gave it to me for my 13th birthday, like the third Harry Potter in English or something, because I just kind of liked English at school, and we were reading short stories and sort of smaller stuff. And then I had this big fat book that I had to work through. And I've recently found like vocabulary lists, and there was like wand and cauldron and all these like Harry Potter words, which then I then knew, and they were kind of useless at school for, the basic stuff. But that, and I understood like 10% or something, but I knew the third volume, so I kind of could make sense of Sirius Black and whatever. And then I think that really led me to choosing English classes and English courses, and then we were reading the sort of classics like To Kill a Mockingbird or Romeo and Juliet was my first Shakespeare in English, and then so we kind of slowly covered the basics, and I did my A-levels, so the German A-levels in English and French, so that was very literature based. And then I just thought, okay, well, I love literature, I love English, I'm just going to do that, which I seem to be good at and which I seem to like. So it was sort of a pretty clearish path. But then it was, of course, like a bit of a culture shock to go from Germany to the UK and to have lots of things not done that British people had done. But that also was nice in a way, because then you come at it with fresh eyes and with sort of a bit of a more mature outlook, I suppose.
Florence, one of the things that I'm interested to ask is, in your role as an early career fellow at the University of Sheffield, what does that involve? What do you do?
So I have I proposed a research project for 3 years, which is, I guess, like a glorified PhD project, I would suppose, like a proper project with the result of hopefully a book. And that project was on, or is on, brackets in Renaissance romance, so early modern romance. And I have a lot of precious quality research time, I suppose, because I have very little administrative tasks or duties. There's some teaching, but that's kept at a low level, so I can do the research and really try to develop a research sort of CV and really dig deep and get to spend time with punctuation and books, and kind of meet scholars and work in the archives and this kind of stuff. So that's really a great scholarship to have, because you can really focus on the work. And what I do day to day, I suppose, is well, at first I had to realize what is punctuation actually. I'm still not entirely sure, and it sounds niche, but there are actually some publications on that, also some for the general public. I mean, I'm sure you might have come across Lynn Truss's Eats, Shoots, Leaves, maybe the panda. It has like a panda on the cover, and that is sort of the zero tolerance approach to punctuation, where I would distance myself from. I think punctuation is way more subjective. So I read on punctuation, what it is, what it does. I read early modern romances, try to find out how the punctuation works in those texts. I try to put together publications. It's sort of also a long-term project, so I need to think about it in terms of a book. And a spin-off from this academic work has been another book that I'm sort of writing in between, which is a book just in general about punctuation. So what I've talked about before, where did it come from actually? Not just the bracket, but punctuation in general. Where does the dot come from, right? We have started using it, and also something that most people don't realize, including myself, when they come to the theme, is that spaces between words is actually the hugest, biggest invention in terms of punctuation and sort of writing, because in antiquity people wouldn't do that, and right up until the 8th century people hadn't done that, so they would just write in a continual line. And then you spend a lot of time trying to find out where what one word ends and one word begins. And so I'm trying to find out how to retrace the steps of how did we come to our current punctuation, and I feed that back into law, legal issues around punctuation, but fun stuff, and cultural stuff, and digital, for instance. How do we what's the deal with our texting and punctuation when we use full stops and exclamation marks and this kind of stuff? And I'm writing a book now for a general public on the topic, which is a lot of fun because it's very free writing and sort of conversational, like what we have now, just in written form, I suppose.
Florence, maybe if you could offer us some kind of overview into the research that you've done, particularly with regards to, say, punctuation and writing.
Yes, so there is a magisterial book, the seminal book about the history of punctuation, which is, I think, from 1992, and I've worked quite a lot with that, and then sort of spread out from there. But so that book is really good at unpicking and looking at old manuscripts, fragments from antiquity or like the early Middle Ages, and across the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, because sort of by, I guess, 1700, 1800, punctuation pretty much was established the way we use it today. And what we do today is sort of like standing on the shoulders of giants, I suppose, just reusing things in a way. So that very much is punctuation in the West, of course, or in sort of Latin languages, Latin-based languages. So in classical times, the idea was of an orator, of course, of Cicero, Quintilian, just giving speeches in the Senate, for instance. So writing wasn't supposed to be read; you were supposed to just hear it, right? Or if you would get a scroll, get a transcript of it, the text needed to be clean so that you can interpret it. Because when you put punctuation in, like for instance, choosing when a word stops and starts, or when to put a full stop, when to decide when a sentence is done, or I mean, they didn't obviously have those signs, but if a sentence is a statement or question, you interpret, right? So firstly, scribes were not allowed to do that, because most of the time there were maybe freedmen or men of not of a high class. So they had to just be a catalyst, as it were, to just give the words, but not interpret it. So that's partly why there's no space between the words, or no other kind of signal where something stops and starts. And another reason is that you were supposed to engage with the text. So when you would sit down and you have your sister or speech or something, you are engaging with it, right? You think about it, you interpret it, and then you put the punctuation in as well. And if you would give a speech, you would put your individual punctuation. So you would decide, you would have your little notes and little signs, like we have when we maybe hold like give a paper or something. We have our own little individual notes, when to pause and so on. There was some kind of concept of a paragraph, for instance. So there is evidence of indentation or putting leaves. For instance, I think the Hedera, the ivy leaf that we might still know of today, like beautiful books, sort of prettified books, that was around since 200 BC, I think. So, and that also marked the end of something. So there is some kind of concept of beginning and end of sections, for instance. But still, it would be very hard to read an unpointed text, what they would call. And there's sort of anecdotes where there's a kerfuffle, I think, on the street, and with some politicians, and somebody gets I can't remember his name, but he gets a paper thrown to his hand, and he's supposed to read this now and like hold this speech, like impromptu kind of speech based on this paper. And he's like, I can't do it because I have never read it and it's unpointed. I would make a fool of myself. And through these sort of anecdotes, we can reconstruct that writing really was not supposed to be read. It was just a record of speech. So also an attitude towards writing. But actually, that's the Roman kind of situation. But the Romans actually lost a realization that the Greeks already had, because the first sort of punctuation or suggestions of punctuation happened, oh gosh, I don't know which century. I think also 3rd century BC, by Aristophanes, who was one of the head librarians of the library at Alexandria. And his concern was to make Greek pronounceable or readable for non-native Greek speakers. So he would put diacritical marks, so how to pronounce Greek. But that also meant that he had to tell people when does a word start and when does it stop, where. And so he started to put dots at different lines, different levels of the line, to mark pauses, but also already mark grammatical sections. So, for instance, now we pause slightly when there's a comma, we pause a bit longer when there's a full stop, to put it very simply. And a comma is a smaller unit of a sentence, right? So he would have people put a dot in the middle of the line, relative to the letters, to say you have to pause a little bit here. And this is not the ending of a sentence, but this is the end of a smaller section of a sentence. So a concept, sensitivity to the building blocks of language was already there, and to the pauses. And what I find myself struggling with very much is the difference between punctuation for grammar, based on grammar, so the smaller the building blocks of the sentence, as it were, and punctuation based on rhetoric. So a punctuation that you use when you want to pronounce something, you want to give a speech, because in the end, I think it's really so intimately intertwined that it would be foolish even to start to make differences between when do we pause when a sentence is finished, or when we want to take a rhetorical pause. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that system of dots on the level of the line got lost during Roman antiquity, but then it found its way into grammars, and was revived in the early Christian, or like early Middle Ages, through Christian scholars. Because once you have a religion based on a book, you have to make sure that the orthodoxy is being preserved, right? So the way that people would do that, scribes or theologians or church fathers, would be to actually use the layout. So they would actually just write smaller lines on the next line, smaller sentence structures, one after the other. So actually not the whole kind of line and using the entire space of the page, but to break it up and put it on different lines. So afterwards, you can't actually change it anymore, because if you would meddle with the way something looks like, it's just not possible anymore, right? So you have a page, and then you would just have maybe one section of a sentence, the next section, and the next section, and the next section, and around it maybe some decoration or something. So you can't change it anymore. So you can't actually change what the Latin says. And there are a couple of interesting examples, for instance, about the very beginning of the Bible, actually, where God is the Word, and I don't know it by heart, but there are two ways of interpreting that, depending on where you pause and depending on where you think the sentence stops and the sense stops. And so it is actually, when it's about salvation, about your soul, it's actually quite important what the sentence says and where the boundaries are. So people who or scribes try to control the meaning through the layout and through the dot system. So that was revived through the grammars that were kind of passed on through the hundreds of years. And finally, by some Irish monks in the 8th century, I think late 7th, beginning of the 8th century, we have the putting of spaces between words. And they did that because they themselves didn't know Latin very well. And the attitude towards the word had changed. So the word or the text wasn't, a text or writing wasn't thought of as a record of speech anymore, but a different manifestation of language in a way, and recording information. So they would encounter Latin just by looking at it. And it's not their native language. And then they were sort of confused about the Latin endings, prefixes, suffixes, and the case system and all this kind of stuff. So they were like, okay, we need to make sense of this. Let's put just a tiny, tiny little space between the words, where they begin and where they end. And this really, I mean, is just a massive invention, because it speeds up writing like nothing else, really. And it's sort of a thing that everybody has been waiting for to be invented. I feel like after this, there's no going back. Like, we will never go back to a time that there's no internet. So you could sort of never go back to a time where you have this continual writing. And from then on, different kinds of experimentations with the level of the dots on the line. Slowly and surely, the spacing between words would sort of be would spread. And then, of course, by the early Renaissance, so scholars like Petrarch and Coluccio Salutati, so the early humanists, would try to keep refining their Latin, keep refining their way of expressing. So every time I guess there's an invention of punctuation or exploration of punctuation, it means it means that there's a need, right? So we have a need for clearer communication, faster reading, or a need to make sure that what I write to you cannot interpret it in any other way than I intend. Same as with the Bible, right? So meaning has to be fixed. It's always an attempt to fix meaning and to make it less interpretable. The interesting thing, of course, in terms of, for instance, literature, is that actually punctuation that is supposed to disambiguate sense actually can also make it really ambiguous, which is where I think it becomes really interesting and fertile to look at punctuation that actually messes up the sense and makes things more complicated, whereas actually you would think that that's the other way around. So the humanists somehow felt a need for clearer defined pauses. So they sort of within 150 years or so, you have an explosion of invention of punctuation marks to make pauses more refined. For example, brackets. So that's my specialty. Brackets were first used, literally invented by Coluccio Salutati in 1399 in a manuscript called De Nobilitate Legum et Medicinae, I think. So it's about the law and medicine, a sort of a rival conversation between these two, and he's defending law. And apparently there was a need that he wanted to section a little part of a sentence off and really make that visible to the reader. So he sort of experiments with different kinds of pointy brackets, and then across the century, the 15th century, they become round, and later they sort of solidify as round. But that means there is a finer way of pausing and of signaling in the sentence which belongs to what, and what's the relationship between those parts of the sentence. And then in the 1590s, you have already, the invention of the printing press. This is the second generation of printers who are super concerned with making the page very clear and legible, different kind of fonts, Roman being invented, italic being invented. And then Aldus Manutius, or Aldo Manuzio, the Venetian printer, invents the semicolon for one of the scholars who feels like he needs more refined pausing, again, between a colon and a comma, which is very subtle. All of this is very subtle, but there was a sort of need to have more defined, more precise pausing in communication. And again, this is very much for somebody who's reading a text, because if I were to dictate a text for you now, and you put the punctuation, even though you know maybe really what the sense of when to put a semicolon, when to put a colon, and when to put, I don't know, a full stop and a comma and so on, and a dash and whatever, the odds are you wouldn't really be able to tell the difference between a colon and a semicolon, right? If I just read it out to you. So this was very much concerning the page, the way it looks like as well. And then as we go through the 16th century, dot, dot, dot starts to appear, or sort of hyphen, 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 which is when you want to express hesitation or doubt. The question mark and the exclamation mark are being used much more than they were before, although they have been invented and they had been around for quite a while. So as there's an explosion of writing, there's a spreading of kind of the forms of punctuation, how they look like as well, and that becomes solidified again. And there's a need to encode tone and feeling and expression in writing. So it's not just the dot anymore. It's not just where a sentence stops and starts, but you also want to say, how does it sound like? How does it feel like? You want to encode hesitation or doubt, or you want to open a gap actually by dot, 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 because right when we text and we put dot, 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 it can be super ambiguous. Like, what does he mean by that now? Is it passive aggressive, or is it funny? There's actually quite a lot of margin for interpretation. And that's sort of it was a sub-tour, I guess, through the centuries of punctuation. And then my work also goes up to now, actually, where I'm very interested in texting and punctuation behavior. For instance, I encourage everyone to go and look at their text messages and see when they use a full stop. Because I don't know how it is with you, but when you text and you just want to do it super quickly and you say, do you want to have pizza for dinner or whatever? Or let's have pizza for dinner. I wouldn't put a full stop. I would just dash that message off and send it. But then if you have a deeper conversation, and these texting 2 a.m. text conversations, they become deeper, and you have longer chunks of text, and maybe you even don't just dash it off, but you use a line that you do with the return button, right? Then we actually suddenly start to still care about punctuation, and we still use it. So although punctuation seems to get lost nowadays because communication has become so fast, it still means something, and when we take care to put it in, that becomes very meaningful as well. And for instance, certain politicians on Twitter use a lot of dot, 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 dot to open up space for interpretation as well. I think there are a couple of studies how Donald Trump uses the dots, and now that Twitter has, you have more space in Twitter, where you don't just have those, 240 characters anymore, but more. People thought it would be the death of his ellipses, of his ... which is not the case. So to wrap this point up of my research, that's the kind of research about, or interest in, where does punctuation come from? Why are we using it? How did it come about? But then I'm also interested in how does it work in literature. So, for instance, Jane Austen, we think of her as super sleek and using the semicolon, which becomes super graceful. And this is the Jane Austen-like elegance that she's expressing in her sentences. But actually, if you look at her manuscripts, they are not super messy, but they're messy enough. And they have lots of dashes and abbreviations and short forms. And those semicolons were actually put in and cleaned, everything was cleaned up by her editor. But we don't encounter it that way. So we sort of think of the actual book in the end as the thing that she has been producing. But actually she has done something quite different. Also readable. I think there's just two different versions of, Pride and Prejudice of the same text. So I think through these kinds of detailed close readings or analyses, we can also start to realize what does it actually mean to us when there are several people working on a piece of writing, something as big and sort of culturally significant, especially for the UK, like Jane Austen or Shakespeare. And that then opens up questions concerning authorship and authenticity, and what does it mean to us? Do we have to really have the thing that the author made? Very often it's not even possible to reconstruct that, because maybe the compositor knew the text better than Shakespeare and had more of a kind of feeling for, I don't know, dramatic text or something like that. So I look at literature, but I also look at punctuation in culture, as it were. For example, in chess, when you have certain movements and you have those chess books that describe movements and I don't know, games and stuff, people would put punctuation upside down or certain arrangements of question marks and exclamation marks as shorthand for certain movements. Why that is the case, I don't know. I find it kind of quite interesting and sort of quirky. You have a lot of law cases that are based on ambiguous punctuation. For example, I think in 2017 there was a case in the US where people were not paid for overtime, dairy truck drivers, but they then sued the firm because of an ambiguous comma, and they got, I think, $5 million for eventually then being paid for overtime that the contract actually said they wouldn't be paid for. And now the contract reads differently with a semicolon to really make sure, what kind of tasks those truck drivers have. So I guess we think about, we don't actually pay attention to punctuation because it's so invisible, and it's supposed to be invisible in a way. But actually, when you think about it a little bit, it can be quite impactful on how we communicate with each other and how life is organized, I think.
And just lastly, Florence, before we have to end our conversation, just curious, if you were to be given a piece of advice, let's say, to anyone who might be watching or listening, if they're at all interested in studying English and English language at an academic level, what might you say to them?
Yes, I would say read as much as you can, whatever you read. It really doesn't matter if you read like what's supposed to be high class literature or mangas, comics, magazines, whatever it is. I think when you then eventually go on and study it, you really look at a diversity of texts. So just absorb anything you can in, whatever form or medium or something. So that's one thing, just read, because you sort of also absorb words or expressions or punctuation rules or something like that just by reading a lot. And don't be afraid of writing. So just write lots of stuff, try your hand at different kinds of, write a play and never stage it, or stage it with your friends, or write a diary, write letters, try different styles and imitate stuff. And it takes a long, long, long while, I think, to find your own voice, but you only do that by at first sort of inhabiting the voice of other people, and then that kind of comes together and you realize you start to develop your own voice. And don't be shy, you know, to share it, or don't share it if you don't feel like it. But I think as long as you just keep reading and keep writing, that's super great starting point in a way, because then you really get to refine it when you study and when you write essays and you focus and you really go deep. So I guess be sort of take the broad view and take it all in, but also then take some time and really go deep with a single word or a single poem or a page of something and try to find out why do you like it. I guess thinking. I guess at university you learn how to think, right? More than getting a degree or getting a paper or something like that. And you only can learn to think if you actually think. So I guess the practice and the keeping at it is what I would guess I'd recommend to people. And most of all, just have fun and not be, feel like you can't read certain kind of stuff because it's not appropriate. Anything is appropriate, and you will find your way towards, I guess, literature that's still around after 500 years because it's good.